Hello, and welcome to Words That Burn, the podcast taking a closer look at poetry. On this episode, I am joined by Belfast poet Matthew Rice, who's here to talk to me about his new collection, Plastic. His poems have appeared in the Poetry Review, Poetry Ireland Review, and the Forward Book of Poetry 2022. He holds an MA in poetry from Queen's University Belfast and a PhD from the Seamus Heaney Centre at Queen's. Matthew, thanks a million for coming on the podcast to discuss your new collection.
How you doing? It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for coming on. Much appreciated. So, Plastic is probably one of the more innovative collections in terms of format that I've seen in a while. It is a series of poems that take place between the ticks of a clock in a single night on a factory shift. And you describe the atmosphere of the factory night shift and the toil and toll that type of work takes on a person throughout the collection. So when I was reading, the poems themselves feel intensely autobiographical. And I was wondering, when you were writing it, how did poetry help to navigate the types of night shift you're describing in the collection?
Yeah, so I can understand the autobiographical aspect that you pick up on, and that's true to an extent. To the fact that it's intensely autobiographical, the book is obviously drawn from experiences, but it's a kind of an amalgamation of experiences. So this is not just one factory; it's drawn from experiences in various factories and warehouses and offices, general kind of low-paid kind of labor, and so this particular imagined factory floor just made sense this in. But yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the really personal stuff is filtered through allusions to art, pop culture in certain parts. And I think that's because those sorts of things shaped who I am growing up. They molded my thinking as I was growing up. And so I'm kind of like, so that's definitely a factor. It's a strange book. It really is a strange book. As you mentioned, it's in time-stamped sections with a prologue and an epilogue. What I was trying to do was just trying to honor that space, a space that doesn't really feature much in contemporary Irish poetry, if at all. This book was born out of my PhD. It was the creative component of my PhD. And in my research, I was unable to identify comparative text. There's a few shipyard poets, one, two, maybe. Thomas Cairnduff. Joseph Campbell occasionally wrote about the shipyard, but never really in a factory, and particularly a plastic molding factory, because I hadn't have them back then. The nearest comparative thing I saw in my research was the American factory poets, which is a kind of tradition. Philip Levine, Larry Levis, Fred Voss, to a lesser extent, Raymond Carver, Charles Bukowski, blue collar type stuff. I was just trying to create a space for that and mingle it with my own experience. And I felt it was a gap in the poetry market. It was something that was fresh. Funny enough, this is actually my second book. My first book came out, and that's the book that I wrote while I was in the factory. And there's nothing in my first book about the factory. It's all about escaping out of it. The poems are unrelated, and that's because I just had a different calling while I was working in the factory. So it wasn't until I left that I realized that was material that could be utilized and also honored, offer some dignity to it. You mentioned form. It's meant to represent the malleability of humanity. Also, the way the poems look on the page, the shape. It's all about trying to transmit the performativity of scattered thought under pressure in real time.
It definitely does that. You have so many poems that take on unique forms. You've some acrostics that reference crosswords that you do in the paper, in the break room of the factory. You've got little snippets of real life text come in, urgent notices on particular jobs that need to be fulfilled before the end of the day. For you, do you set out inspired by that type of form, or does the form follow what you want to write about?
So I definitely set out writing the book knowing that I wanted there to be different forms. It wasn't a conscious thing, actually. It was when the poet Gail McConnell, she saw an early uncompleted draft when I was just starting it, and she picked up on what the poetry looks like on the page and how that can be likened in a way to the plastic mold, the different shapes that the plastic comes out in if it's put into different molds. And I was like, oh, right enough, actually. yeah, I didn't realize that that's what I was doing. So then once I then became conscious of it, I realized that the book had to be in different forms. It couldn't just be like all free verse. It couldn't just be like all sonnets. It couldn't be all whatever. And I also wanted, there's some right aligned verse and stuff in it. And I just
Hmm.
wanted to, there's actually a poem in it that kind of, it talks about the root of the word work, I think, in different languages, right through to the Latin tripalium, which the root of that is, it translates literally as an instrument of torture. So like I'm trying to make it look like some sort of instrument of torture on the page,
Yeah.
but without trying to overplay that hand. So hopefully the form is subtle enough, but mostly it's trying to. I mentioned the kind of the representation of sporadic thought under pressure in real time. That's the main concern. But it's funny, every review I read, everyone I speak to who's read the book, you find out more about your own book and
Sure.
what the book is doing. I mean, it's not just about somebody working in a factory and not making much money and dreaming of being some sort of artist. It's also about there's Marxist tones, there's political tones, there's historical tones. There's all sorts of allusions in there, which I guess I was semi-conscious of. But it's only when you see the thing finished and you see it cohere as a whole,
Mm,
because I think of this book as a single poem
mm.
in time-stamped sections. But I wanted to write a long poem that I would want to read. I find it, I tune out sometimes. If I read a 50-page long poem that's all just in verse and there's no kind of sections or breakups, just one continuous long poem, I sometimes find it difficult to tune in. I have to put it down and pick up again. But whenever I read, for example, The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot for the first time, it's in 5 sections. It's a single poem, but it's in 5 sections. And the sections seem a little bit disparate, but they're still part of a whole. And I enjoyed that because you feel like you're starting afresh with each section rather than just reading the whole continuous same thing. Joseph Brodsky's poem, 2 Hours and an Empty Tank. It's another long poem in sections. I think they have 29 sections. Again, they act as way stations or breathers
Mm.
in between sections so you can get through the poem in one sitting. And then, of course, another big blueprint for me when I was thinking about how to structure the book was Stephen Sexton's If All the World and Love Were Young, which I firmly believe with the word masterpiece is used often, but I do genuinely believe it's a modern masterpiece. Genuinely original, right down to how the language functions syllabically on the page in relation to the 16-bit memory console itself. So yeah, so factors like that all factor into what you're doing. But the phone thing and how it looks on the page, it starts off unconscious, then more conscious you become of it. You run with it rather than contrive.
A few things that you touched on there, including how other people perceive your work and receive your work, and then how it resonates for them, is important because, yes, there are huge political and Marxist undertones running throughout the collection. But the one that struck me the most, I think, is, and I might be wrong in how I picked it up, but because the quote at the beginning of the collection is from Jacques Rancière, which I've definitely pronounced incorrectly because I really struggle with French, is he says,
Yep.
the question of maintaining and transgressing the barrier that separates those who think from those who work with their hands. I think that's really interesting because I think for a lot of people, unconsciously, they assume there is a difference between art, thought, philosophy, whatever way you want to look at it, and hardworking people that do labor jobs like you were describing, the office, the factory floor, and so on. I was wondering if you could talk to me about how you think poetry can help lift people out is probably too grand a term, but how it can provide some form of escape or rest from the relentless toil of work that a lot of us find ourselves in today. Because for me, throughout the collection, there's a lot of that. The way I looked at it, one of the things I really enjoyed about it is you have a lot of accidental poets featured as characters. So you have people who work on the shop floor who suddenly, in one breath, are talking about AC/DC, and in another breath are talking about a burning building, but they speak poetically. They suddenly launch into verse that wouldn't be out of place in a romantic poem, or you could hear being written by Keats. And I wanted to ask you about how that works, how you think poetry can deliver people from the relentless kind of toil that they go through.
Yeah, it's a great question. In a sense, it did that for me. I identified it as a passion. I mean, I was always written poetry as a child, but I didn't ever think to do anything with it until I was in my early 30s, or sorry, late 20s. And then once I developed a passion, I was able to identify a direction I wanted to go in. And that was all poetry. Like, I would never have done an undergraduate degree part-time whilst working full-time in the factory through the Open University in English language and literature if it wasn't for poetry. And then if I hadn't have stuck with that degree and got it, then I wouldn't have been able to do a master's at Queen's in poetry and criticism. And then if I hadn't, which then would have led, I've just recently completed my PhD. I actually graduate in
Congratulations.
2 weeks.
Congratulations.
Cheers. And out of that PhD, not only came a critical subject, but also this book. So in a way, poetry did literally deliver me from that relentlessness. But I'm very careful when talking about that because I don't want to diminish the work that factory workers do. It's vital. They are vital. I did it for 15 years in various places. I just felt that I wasn't happy. And I'm not saying that I don't really know what, when someone says you're happy, I don't really know what that means because I always feel a bit depressed no matter how well things are going.
It's probably why you're a poet, Matthew.
So I definitely knew that I wanted to go in a different direction and I wanted to publish poetry and I wanted to be involved in professing it in some way or passing it on or helping others become poets and make their work better if I can. And maybe that would help make my work better and things like that. So I definitely decided to allow, rather at the time poetry was revolving around me, I wanted to revolve around poetry. As twee as that sounds, but it's the truth. And so I think it's very important. I mean, I think what you're talking about is escapism from perceived dreariness. And I guess another thing the book is doing is examining how time can affect the mind depending on what you're doing and how imagination can then become a vehicle for escape. I mean, one of the things that I used to do when I worked a night shift for a whole year, and I would have really weird dreams during the day when I was sleeping that I would then remember vividly at night. And I would then replay them in my head and try to kind of make them even more vivid and trying to add more details in or remember more details and also almost play them like a movie in my head. And there's a couple of dream sequences in this which are born directly out of that. It's remembered dreams that you kind of just use in your own mind to play on a kind of film loop. Another technique I used was pretending I was Marshall Mathers in the 8 Mile.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
This is only one scene in your life. This is only one part of the script type of thing. I know that might sound corny to people, but these are the things that go through your mind whenever you're longing to be doing something that you're actually passionate about, rather than just earning a minimum wage crust with no benefits to buy a few beers at the weekend.
So that idea of dream time and time in general is a core theme that comes up again and again in the collection. Sometimes the factory of your collection stretches time out unbearably and you're forced to endure it. And then other times, in the brief moments you get, you have a few poems where during the course of the night shift you step outside of the factory. One is to have a cigarette, another one is to go to Tesco to get your lunch. Those seem to be much shorter. How do you approach mapping time in your poems? Do you have particular ways that you like to shorten poems and lengthen poems, or does it come up naturally every time you want to write about it?
Yes, so timestamps were, as far as I can remember, because whenever you're in the flow, I'm sure it's the same for any writer of prose or poetry. But for me, I can't really remember the writing of the work. I only come to myself after it's put on the page, and then I realize what's on the page, and then I tinker with it. That's when I'm conscious of what I'm doing. I'm never really conscious of what I'm doing whenever I'm writing it. I do believe in the Paul Muldoon proclamation that the poet is a vessel for whatever it is that does it through you.
Okay.
Not to get too mystical, but I do think that is a factor, and I can't explain it. I mean, the late Michael Longley said that if he knew where poems came from, he would go there, which is another way of saying that you're just the vessel, something else does it through you. You need to open yourself up, make yourself open for. Noel Gallagher, the musician, says it's like, he uses a metaphor of like dipping the rod in and trying to fish for a song. And if you don't do that, you best be sure that Chris Martin's doing it. And if you're not fishing, he's fishing and he'll take all the songs. You have to. So that's just another way of saying you need to be open for inspiration, open for whatever might come through you. So, sorry, can you just remind me of what the start of the question was there?
It's fine. It was how you approach stretching time and shortening time, as in literature.
I just demonstrated it there by losing track of it.
Well, it's a good example. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so the timestamps came pretty organically, and it's tied into that thing of kind of not really being aware of what you're doing. But
Mm,
it's born out of real experience. There certain parts of the night would drag. So, for instance, the short kind of lunchy poems.
mm,
That's because you only get half an hour for lunch, and it flies in, and then you're back to the time dragging again.
yeah.
I guess that would be reflective of that. Now, in hindsight, again, you're telling me something about my book, which is really interesting. But I didn't think to myself, okay, this has to be 317, this has to be
Yeah.
319, this has to be 2003. I tried to map a memory of a night shift that I worked and try and kind of be faithful to try and put myself back in that moment of like clocking in, and then how does it feel once you've clocked in? How would this night go?
Mm,
And how did you used to like think? Because like I did read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which we might touch on later on, which is a recurring motif throughout the book. That kind of dual questing through the night shift,
mm.
and then Gawain, and the absurdity of both quests in a way. So I took those memories and tried to paste them in real time through the book. The book is representative of true clock watching, because you're not
Yeah.
watching every second. And you
Yeah.
will lose sometimes 10 minutes will go by without you realizing it, or half an hour go by without you realizing it. And then other times you'll notice time, and it'll drag more.
Mm.
So that was the basic framework of what I was trying to do in terms of representation of time and how it's stretched and how it slows and how it quickens.
So that brings us very comfortably over to Gawain, who I was really surprised to find come up more than once throughout the collection, because I just
Yeah,
don't associate
yeah.
plastic molding with medieval knights. It doesn't come up for me. But he is a wonderful kind of jerk you out of the reality of the factory presence a few times in the collection. What is Gawain for you? What does he represent to you specifically, and why is he the text you reference? I'm sure you read loads of books while you were working night shifts, and lots of things kept you company, but why is Gawain the one that you go for here?
It's the book that made the biggest impression on me. I read W.S. Merwin, the late great American poet's
Mm.
translation of it, which is a bilingual. So they have the original Old English, and then you have Merwin's version of it
I didn't know he'd done a translation of that. That is going straight in my shopping
yeah,
basket after this.
it's published by Blood Axe. So
Oh, very good.
you should be able to get a hold of it either online or in a shop somewhere. And then I think it was a few years ago, the film came out as well
Hmm.
by David Lowery, starring Dev Patel and Alicia Vikander and Joel Edgerton. And I just loved it. Anyone else I've
Yeah.
spoken to didn't like it. I loved it. I thought it was a
No, it's
fantastic.
great. I think it's as close as I've seen a visual, as I had to do a whole module on it when I was at university
Oh, really?
on medieval verse and Middle English. And
Yeah.
I charted all that Old English all the way through. And I remember reading them when I was in university and going, these are mental. These are insane. These don't make
Yeah.
any sense. And I watched the Dev Patel one and I was like, oh, David Lowery gets it. He
Yeah.
gets how weird
Yeah.
these little stories are. And I thought it was pretty close.
The Barry Keoghan scene was
Oh,
absolutely, he's frightening. He's a
yeah,
frightening
it's such a fever dream
person.
of a moment.
So there was that made the biggest impression of me out of the
Mhm.
books that I read while I was working on night shift. And also it made sense. I see Gawain in the book as an avatar for the speaker,
Okay.
a caged little avatar, and the speaker is anonymous. Gawain was written by Anonymous. We don't know
Yeah.
who wrote Gawain either. There's that questing element, the bizarre task that he has to get through the quest to do at the end of the quest.
Mm.
What's quite bizarre, standing pushing the same button over and over again to produce a part for someone else with no benefits and very little money. So, I mean, it's not the same thing as having to have your head cut off.
So it
But,
depends on how bad a day you've had. But
you're certainly having something cut off, whether it be existentially. And the third function was basically what you say, a way to jerk you out of this world and then
mm.
place you back into it again. And it's representative again. I mean, everything is intended in this book. Everything, any typo, any word that isn't in the dictionary, any form, everything's intended because
Mm.
it's that thing about representing, being faithful to how my mind was working during that period of my
Mm.
life on those shifts. And that's the best way that I personally felt that I could represent it. And thinking about Gawain, you're trying to turn your own shift into a kind of adventure. And you
Of
do
course.
that again, as I mentioned earlier, via the vehicle of imagination.
Yeah.
And so Gawain is, so those are the three things that Gawain is specifically for me doing in the book.
Would you mind reading us one of those Gawain poems just so that we have a sense of what you're talking about, please?
The dappling light and all its implications are in play when, with one leg folded over the other, Gawain on my lap, pen clucking over my notebook, Billy reneges on his conviction. I'm hard, but my dad's harder. Grown-up teeth are parents' embodiments, the way a factory canteen is for an insect a city. The way Shelley's calcified heart resisting fire embodied only phenomenon. Yeah, my hands have been dirty too, little Gawain might have said, closing his hand around his Granny Smith, miles still from the night's hibernation, his green axe a correspondence of green. To a girdle, little Gawain might have said, to a field of dead, an interlude of kisses. But still Billy's interrogation. You ever been in a fight? Coy of my hand succeeding to the squeeze. My knocked down Nikes redolent of morning dirt. I've read some very, very good reviews of my book in some very good places, and I wish I could retain the information because people have talked about the Gawain motif far more articulately than me, and have also told me things again about what they think that Gawain is, how he's functioning in the narrative. And somebody, I think in the New Poetry Review, there's a conversation review with Alice Hiller and Jane Clark talking about plastic, and they're talking about kind of the imperialistic representation, colonialism. And I don't think that was in my mind. I was writing it, but after reading that review and then looking back at the book, yeah, that's in there too. The English element. It's amazing what a good review you can open up for you about your own book.
Don't discredit yourself too much there, Matthew. I mean, it's the collection that leads to the review.
I know, I need to stop doing it. I do that very often.
Yeah, I mean, it's all well and good to have a good review, but they need something to review, and that's you.
To
So
review,
congratulations. But I think that's the nice thing about collections, especially coherent collections like this one, because not all collections have a coherent theme. Some of them write to disparate parts of someone's psyche or any amount of influences, and they don't necessarily have to connect. That's not what I'm saying. But when you get one like this that explores so many aspects of who we are today societally, you get so many aspects. You do get people that get to. So I'm going to steal this from. I just had an interview with Mark Ward, who's another poet from Dublin.
Yep.
And he said he looks at it as any collection is holding a prism up to the light and spinning it, and then watching all those refractions go all over the place. And some people will be hit by some of the refraction and other people will be hit by the other ones. So you end up with so many interpretations that lead to a really interesting take on your collection. But I mean, you're doing the same in a lot of places in your collection. You certainly have literary allusions, and again, an unexpected character to find was Wolverine. There's a poem in here that references Wolverine Origins, which is a comic I read when I was 15, and in a testament to being transported back to a time in your life, my little brain lit up when I saw the word Logan. I was like, that's comics, that's great. And likewise, there's another section there where you talk about Michael Fassbender's character in Prometheus. What is it about modern stories and movies that draw you in?
They're a massive part of my life. Film, I guess, is my second love. I don't think I go through a day without doing an impression of some sort of actor doing a line from some film. I'm always thinking about movies. I'm always watching movies and rewatching films I've already seen. I rewatched The Dark Knight the other day, and I guess I did that because of what's happening in Belfast at the time of recording, because it just feels like the Joker has been let loose at the minute. But so I guess I find a real life connection through all types of art. I mean, I love seeing artistic references in other people's work too. It's a brilliant, my favorite novel by Fosse. Well, it's 3 novels in one. It's septology, you call it. 3 novels across 7 parts, published by my publisher, actually, Fitzcarraldo. And it's a fantastic book. It's all one sentence. It has punctuation, but it's essentially one sentence across for 800 pages. And
that's an impressive feat.
I know, it's amazing. He won the Nobel shortly after, so that probably sealed it for him to be able to do that. But the conceit revolves around two doppelgangers, Asla and they're both painters. One used to drink and stopped and has been able to continue his painting career and be relatively successful. The other one lives in the country, in Norway. The other one lives in Björgvin, in the city. And he's a tragic alcoholic who's equally as talented, but just hasn't been able to keep his life together. So there's artistic references all the way through that. There's poetic references all the way through that. And that hooks me in as a reader. So I guess it hooks me in as a writer too. In terms of the Wolverine thing, I mean, that again comes out of a direct real life experience. There was X-Men comics in the canteen. No one really knew who they belonged to, so I just invented a character and made them belong to him. And I did actually read that origin story comic in the canteen one time on break. And the Fassbender thing, Prometheus, for me, that film from which that Fassbender reference comes from in the book, is fascinating for me because on the one hand, it's terribly average. It's one of them Ridley Scott movies where you just he's spent so much time building the world that he's kind of neglected parts of the script and the story. But nevertheless, it's worth watching for Michael Fassbender's performance as the android David. It's fascinating. And the way he mimics, he's obsessed with film in that film. He bases his look on Peter O'Toole and Lawrence of Arabia. And there's actually a quote at the end of that Fassbender section in the book that says, "There's nothing in the desert and no man needs nothing." And that comes from Fassbender saying it to himself in the film, but repeating it because he heard it from Lawrence. So, and again, that feeds into the kind of representation or the duplication of the same plastic part, androids who look the same coming off the conveyor belt, things like that. AI, artificial intelligence. So it all dovetails for me, all that kind of material, when you really start thinking about the mechanics of what any factory does, because there will be realistic human androids in the near future and they're going to be made in factories. So the pop culture stuff isn't just there for the sake of it. There's always a reason behind it.
I wonder, would you mind reading that one for us there?
Fassbender's David in Prometheus takes Gary Newman as his physical muse, rendering an authentic look for his android, a vibe not a million miles away from the lucidly drawn dawn that rises over the set, the dawn of a foreign planet. Fassbender has Newman in his ears between takes. A passage in the script discusses the perils of manufacturing, the hope that David kind coming off the conveyor belt are less and less like humans than humans perceive. I gleaned all this from a behind-the-scenes vignette, which I think about as Gary Newman comes on the factory radio and the timer on my machine beeps the birth of another plastic aeroplane part. It puts me in mind of David mouthing ambivalence. There is nothing in the desert, and no man needs nothing.
I'd be remiss now if I didn't mention the factory itself. I think the thing that compelled me through your collection more than anything else, I enjoyed every single bit of it, but the strange, I'm going to say monster, right? And I say monster because I feel like there's allusions to the Gothic and there's a lot of flesh and blood stuff that I'll touch on a little bit later, but the monster that you've created in the factory is fascinating to me. You spoke a little bit earlier about how it was an amalgam factory of any kind of shop floor you can think of, any place, any time that you can think of. It is the beast that is the manufacturing machine.
Yep.
How do you go about writing about a place like that? Is it drawn from memory? Is it drawn from the books that you've read about anti-capitalism or capitalism itself? How did you build this strange, living but inanimate thing that is the centerpiece of the collection?
Well, that's a great question. Well, first of all, the world building came from my own experience. It wasn't really from, there's no literature that you can really read around capitalism, late stage capitalism, that could help, that would help you build the world in your head, because it's also abstract. It always comes down to labor and money. But when you say labor, what do you mean? There's different types of labor. When I think of labor, because I've worked on building sites as well, so whenever I think of labor, I think of building sites, because the technical term you're given to somebody who's a helper on a building site is a laborer. There's different types of labor, whether you're working in a factory or you're working in an office. It's just to what degree is it laborious. But in terms of building that world, you're very right. I think what you're kind of touching on is the factory itself as a character in the book.
Yeah.
And that's very, very true and very intended. It's, again, another filmic influence. was kind of part of my thinking around that. One of my favorite directors, if not my favorite director, is Stanley Kubrick. And his last film, some people love it, some people hate it. I think that's a mark of good art because it
Mhm.
divides, and it either gives you an intense positive feeling or intense negative feeling. There's nothing worse than a piece of art that you look at and go, nah, and you just forget about it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So if you've seen Eyes Wide Shut and you really liked it, then you'll remember all those iconic scenes. But what Kubrick was very aware of in that film, because that film wasn't filmed in New York, even though it's set there and looks like it is, it just looks, Manhattan just looks exactly like, I've been to New York. How they recreated that in Pinewood Studios has been on me. But Kubrick wanted the city itself to be a character,
Mm.
an overarching character, watching what the characters are doing as they move through it. He wanted it to be inanimate, but a breathing kind of organism at the same time, because there's electrical surges going through buildings, there's lights going on,
Absolutely.
going off, there's pubs that are still open and things like that. So that was my inspiration. Kubrick was my inspiration in that regard, in terms of how can I not just make the factory somewhere that the action is taking place in and that the speaker is moving through and existing in. How can I create this sense of kind of ominousness, and even referring to it at one time as like, the factory will never glisten as it glistens this evening.
Mm.
That's giving agency to the building itself, the actual bricks and mortar of it,
Yeah.
in my mind. And yeah, hopefully I've constructed my own world, but it was definitely influenced by Kubrick's thinking on how he would construct New York for Eyes Wide Shut. I found it fascinating when I read about him on saying that New York is as much a character as Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman, or anyone else.
Mm.
I find that really interesting. That's the first time I'd ever really thought about that.
As a concept. Yeah.
Yeah, as a concept, exactly.
What I love about what you've just described is you talked about the factory will never glisten like it glistens tonight. There is almost for me an unavoidable meshing of the biological and the mechanical throughout the collection. And at times you play it for horror, and other times it is what is happening to the people inside the factory. One of my favorite things of reading this is how you would slip between what should be a cold and sterile mechanical action, pressing the button, watching something inject plastic into a mold, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But you would also splice that with people who run a knife up their finger by mistake, or someone who loses their life in the factory. There's a fascinating intermingling of flesh and blood and steel and electricity. Was that an awareness that you had at the time? Did it emerge as a theme for you and something that you could bring in continually, or is it just the natural way that you think about this type of work and labor?
Yeah, so I'm quite an imagistic poet, imagistic person. I always feel strange when I say I'm a poet. So I write very imagistically, I think. And whenever people talk positively about my poems, they will often bring up the imagery and the creation of an image, and or the vividness of an image. And I mentioned Stephen Sexton earlier. One of the things I admire most about his work is how he will verb nouns. There's a bit in the Full of Word and Love We're Young where he talks about, I think he talks about the moonlight purples on the grass. So I'm always interested in how can I bring language alive and through unexpected angles. I think it's interesting to try and imbue inanimate objects or machines that are moving only because a human is instructing it to, with some form of agency, is interesting. Even though that agency doesn't really go anywhere, at the end of the day, that machine is that machine. It doesn't have a brain, it doesn't have a soul, but nonetheless, you're trying to project your own humanity onto
Mm.
onto your environment, especially in a kind of relatively deadening environment like that one, where you're sort of fighting boredom a lot of the time. Might be different for some of the engineers in a factory who are actually working off schematics to design a brand new tool that is going to make a brand new molded part that will be
Mm.
then shipped over to China for them to use in one of their factories. And if you're passionate about that, then that would probably be different. You probably wouldn't be fighting boredom as much. But if you're just kind of one of the low paid laborers and you don't really understand how the machines work or whatever, and if you have a passion for something else beyond the factory, the natural thing is to project humanity, your own humanity, onto the
Mm.
environment. So I guess that's what I'm kind of doing in the book with regards to what you're talking about. Like, I think there's a bit in the book where I talk about my machine marking time. So it becomes
Mm.
almost like a kind of time machine in a way, or a predictor of time, even though it's not. But that was just the way my thinking would go. It's amazing what kind of resisting a bored mind, what you can do.
Yeah.
Especially, I mean, if different sitting in your house on your own board, it's very difficult to then come up with stuff to write. But if you're actually actively doing something, there can be a therapeutic aspect to such boredom, such repetition.
Yeah.
I mean, I certainly did enjoy doing certain jobs in different factories. And when, okay, I want you to deburr these 1,000 parts, and that's all you're doing for the entire shift. So you put your podcast earphones in, sit in the corner of the factory, and you're just deburring.
Yeah.
And you can just get lost listening to your podcast. You're like, oh, this is great. This is easy money. Then other times you're having to like do things that are a little bit more laborious and a little bit more fidgety and pernickety. But yeah, it's all about trying to find the humanity in the environment as a kind of act of survival. I know it might sound dramatic, but you know what I mean?
No, no.
An act of
I
mental
get where you're
survival,
coming from.
emotional survival.
I think you do that in a number of different ways. When you were talking there about how you project your bored mind, or your bored mind rather, projects something interesting onto an otherwise mundane task. I read it, as you talked a little bit about the mystical earlier on, I read it a little bit differently as all that effort that people put into small tasks just washing off on the machines, or just through a weird kind of osmosis just finding their way into the machines. But you invoke that in a much more classic literary way, when you do seem to have certain people who haunt the factory. There's the sequence at the beginning of the poem where you talk about one young man who ended his life in the factory, and his impact is still lingering around on this particular night shift and echoes through. But the Gothic is there consistently throughout parts of it, and sometimes I won't say jump scare, but it leaps out. There's a sequence at the very beginning where you drive past a graveyard on one side, and there's a snail who pushes past the dead. How do you bring the Gothic into that atmosphere, into that cold, essentially un-Gothic place? It is a modern setting. It is as modern as it can get. And yet you manage to bring in ghosts and previous lives. There's one section about Jonathan Swift in there. He haunts the narrative a little bit. How do you go about bringing that kind of stuff into such a sterile environment?
The Jonathan Swift thing, in one of the factories that I worked in, he actually was the prebend in the Diocese of Connor there from 1694 to 1696. And that was a wee town just outside Carrickfergus. And he wrote Tale of a Tub there. And there's a local legend has it that on the way back to England in 1696, he thought that the Cave Hill's profile looked like a giant looking up at the sky, or lying on his back looking up at the sky, and with the land behind. And when you look at it, when you're getting the train out of Grand Central and you come out past through York Street train station on that line, there's an angle of Cave Hill that just looks exactly like a face looking up at the sky, and the land behind it like the hair thrown out. If it is true, I can totally understand why he would get the idea for Gulliver. If people have just come up with that idea because it just so happens to be a coincidence that Cave Hill looks like a giant looking up at the sky, then grand. But I'm a bit of a romantic. I like to believe that he was inspired to write Gulliver's Travels, or got the idea for it because of Cave Hill. But then in terms of the Gothic, I guess again, it's that we talked about the Dark Knight earlier. I guess it's that Christopher Nolan kind of thing where Gotham City, there's like two Gotham cities, isn't there? There's the rich affluent bit with the skyscrapers and the penthouses, and then you've got the Narrows, which is the working class, but nevertheless still a modern, moving environment, very up to date, very present. I probably internalized some inspiration from that kind of setting. I think Nolan's doing something similar to Kubrick in that respect. Gotham is like a character itself that everyone's trying to protect and other people are trying to exploit, which is kind of what happens with human beings. We can be protected or exploited. Obviously, what's happening in a minute in Belfast is pure exploitation by nefarious right-wing sources who have a lot of money, which is kind of what kind of feels like Gotham.
There's that surreal moment where you're watching the likes of, at the time of recording, there are a series of, you can only describe them as racist attacks happening across Belfast in reaction to a horrific event that took place in the city. And as you said, nefarious right-wing forces have decided to take advantage of this and stoke a population that's already pretty much at breaking point at times, just with how little they have in life and looking to place blame anywhere they can, right? But it's such a surreal experience to watch Sky News and see them report so callously on something that's affecting so many people, and then underneath it you see like the ticker tape at the bottom that says Elon Musk encourages those in Belfast, and you're just there going, what in Christ's name? Like, what strange hell is this? It's bizarre.
Elon Musk retweeted something from Tommy 10 Names, Yaxley Lemon, about Carrickfergus. Elon Musk in America is retweeting stuff about Carrickfergus in order to sow division in Northern Ireland.
It's unbelievable, and it just beggars belief. Again, you want to talk about the weird echoes of other influences finding their way into things, like, just nuts. But again, I suppose just really underlining conflict at the heart of your collection, which is an anti-capitalist tone to it. And again, coming back to your idea of Gotham, there are those who have things and there are those who don't. And for some reason, those that have it are obsessed with those that don't. Why? What has it got to do with you?
Live your life.
Yeah.
But I mean, just getting back to the whole Gothic thing, it's an organic process. It's not something that I kind of set out, because you're the first one who's actually used that word Gothic. But now when I think about it, there is a Gothic influence to a lot of this book. I guess it maybe comes from just see, I'm a big fan of people like Keats and Shelley and Coleridge in particular.
Yeah.
And they, I think we use the word romantic these days, but it meant something different when they were.
Absolutely.
It's applied differently to them. Romanticism doesn't mean that they wrote about love all the time, but it's there's a Gothicness to that too. You know?
Absolutely.
So and even with people like John Clare and stuff, I was reading quite a few of their kind of letters to each other and stuff. These different guys while I was kind of researching and writing Plastic, and I guess that kind of was just in my mind and in my thinking, and it's probably just seeped into the writing. But I'm trying to think if I ever intended any of that imagery. No, I think that's when you know you're hitting on something. Whenever something unintended comes out and looks like it's intended.
Yeah,
you know?
Well, you nailed it for me. Yeah. You could have said it was intended and I would have believed you. 100%.
But I'm glad you have that reading, though. That's another wee element that's pretty cool.
Believe it or not, it was the moon that solidified it for me. The moon plays a strange central role towards the end of the collection. It just pops up a few more times. And for me, it was like, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And then there's a few other elements there that drew me into that kind of Gothic reading. But yeah, I want to take a step back from the factory floor itself just for a second and the ticking of the clock. You have a section at the beginning really got to me from the start. It resonated with me an awful lot. It felt almost like incantation or preparation for going to the factory. The first section, which is just as accidents wait for boredom, as that for me was a phenomenal setting. I spoke to you earlier about how the factory is given a life of its own. For me, was an instantaneous kind of teaser for what I was about to get into, because the idea of accidents waiting like a predator outside boredom to leap, I found that absolutely fascinating. But what I found even more fascinating is that preparation ritual that you outline. You have a few of them. You have How 21st Century, I Wake at 3 a.m., and then you have I Shave My Hair to Suede, I Marry Celeste. So you spoke a little bit earlier about nouns as verbs, or verbing nouns, I think is what you said. I Marry Celeste made perfect sense to me immediately. You leave everything perfectly still and untouched, and you slip out to your strange night shift that nobody else is awake for. Can you just talk to me a little bit about what drove you to create this prologue as one long meandering thing?
Yeah, so it was that preparatory thing. I wanted to show a bit of life outside of the factory, outside of work, but where work is always turning over in your head. You're always thinking you're kind of just living for the weekend, but you know you've got to go back to work again in a couple of days. So you're always kind of like, so I wanted to kind of have that kind of preparatory prologue in there before we actually get into the timestamp sections in the book. And then obviously there's an epilogue, which is completely disconnected from the factory. It's like a little glimpse into the future, a kind of wee suggestion of what the speaker was moved to do, or what decision he was moved to make when they realized that they had this calling. The prologue acts as a kind of stealing of the mind, STEELING, stealing of the mind against what's to come.
Yeah.
like a ritual. So you have, I shave my hair to suede, I marry Celeste, I facial hair, I sleeves rolled, I uniform, I mirror, all these things. When you're in a rush getting ready to go to work because you're lying in past your last possible snooze alarm, and you've just going through your head, not really aware of what thoughts, but there's some random thoughts go through your head, fitting in and out as you're kind of getting your stuff
Mm.
together, getting a quick shower, whatever, and all the rest of it. So I wanted to represent that. And then obviously there's the drive to the factory. The speaker, as they're driving to the factory, always visits somewhere in their head where they haven't been. Again, it's all this thing of giving a humanitarian and dignified aspect to the worker, to the factory worker,
Yeah.
to create a dignified space to be able to inhabit this night shift in this place, which would, which goes beyond just a clock-in number or goes beyond a payroll number, trying to flesh out the kind of human behind the worker. I hope that doesn't sound kind of like I am on a pedestal, kind of on a stump somewhere, giving some highfalutin kind of high and mighty speech, because that's not what it's intended for, because I did this work for 15 years. I know the ins and outs of it. It's just about trying to kind of create a rounded kind of human dimension to something that can feel quite inhuman, or at least quite automaton in that environment. So the prologue was definitely written towards that kind of thinking before going into the work, going into the shift.
I think it's very effective because it's beautifully separate from the factory. I wanted to touch on one more thing that I've never seen in another collection. You are officially the first poet that I've seen do this. You have an Easter egg poem in the collection that comes after your notes at the end of the collection. And it's such a beautiful little poem that just sits there. Can you talk me through what that final poem is? It's about your dog, I think.
It's about it's about our late family dog Finn, but it's also about, it was inspired by, I've actually forgotten the name of the poem now, but Miroslav Holub wrote this beautiful poem which has a character in it called Faust. There's a bit in it where he comes across this dog that's in pain, and he talks about, the dog whose pain gives out the reflected light of death, a love whose essence is hopelessness, just as hopelessness has its essence in love. And the poem starts off with the speaker catching his own reflection. It's again that kind of duality talked about earlier with regards to the paralleling kind of questing themes of Gawain and this night shift. Gawain being a kind of occasional avatar for the speaker. Trying to explore that in a kind of seemingly unconnected way, but when you think about it in those terms, it's actually very connected. I wasn't going to include it, and then we lost our dog, so I just thought, you know what, I'm gonna work that up into a kind of Easter egg poem. I mean, I can't take the credit for being the first poet to do that because Michael Longley has done it before, and Stephen Sexton does it in his first book. There's a wee beyond the credits, beyond the acknowledgements, and then if you flick far enough, you'll find this wee poem called a wee secret poem. He's replicating the hidden level of like a computer
Mario
game,
game,
but I thought it was a cool idea. I like things like that. I love hidden tracks. I love hidden poems, so I just wanted my own hidden poem.
Well, you performed it remarkably effectively there. Listen, Matthew Rice, I thoroughly enjoyed reading your collection, Plastic. I think it's a phenomenal achievement, a beautiful long-form poem, which is something I often struggle with as well, like you were saying earlier. The level of variety, the level of illusion, that's illusion with an A, not illusion, that you bring to it is a fantastic read, and I think it's frankly essential reading for anyone who's trying to make sense of what work does to people, what work can do to people, and how looking at life through a capitalist lens can dehumanize people. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Ben. It's been an absolute pleasure.